Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the northern directions, about the battle of the city of Sumy, where the Russians continue their offensive operation, and telling the truth, the Russians show very good dynamic in their offensive, because today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to get the second defense line. I'll remind you that yesterday the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Kondratovka. At least this information was provided by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation and by the group of forces north. And this was the last settlement on the Russia's way towards the settlement of Kherson, which is already a part of the second defense line. And today we got several changes on the ground. The Russians, as you can see, captured 3 lines, trenches, fortifications to the south of the villages of Kondratovka, Andreevka, and Alexeyevka. As for the end of the 5th of June of 2025, we haven't received anything that can confirm Russian attempts or whether the Russians managed to attack or to answer the villages to the south and the villages among the second defense belt. We are talking about Kherson and Fedorivka, but obviously this is something that we should expect, because most likely during the next 24, 48 or 72 hours, the Russians would make their first attempts. The Russians see that Ukrainians can't hold their lines. The Ukrainians are doing everything they can, but they can't stabilize the situation, so that is why until the situation develops in the Russian favor, they would continue. So the Russian offensive in this direction gain its momentum and is continue gaining its momentum. Another important thing that basically we can cut and we can split the Russian Suma offensive operation at least in 3 parts. We're talking about the western flank of Russian Suma offensive operation, the central flank of the Russian Suma offensive operation, and the eastern flank. And of course we can see that there is a completely different situation in every single offensive area, and we see that the Russians managed to get the best results on the western flank of the Suma offensive. We're talking about the territory that we've just discussed. When talking about the central part of the Russian Suma offensive operation, the situation here is much better than on the eastern flank, but not so good as on the western flank. During the previous 24 hours, according to different sources, when talking about the central Suma offensive operation, the Russians established complete control over the settlement of Yablunovka. At least this information today was provided by neutral mappers. As for the end of the 5th of June of 2025, we haven't received neither the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmation or any geolocation that can confirm Russian progress in this direction. But anyway, we believe that tomorrow or the day after, this information would be confirmed as well. But anyway, the Russians are still too far from the Russian progress on the western flank, where the Russians reached the next defense belt. When talking about the central part, there are just 2 villages left, so we're talking about the village of Varachin and Yablunovka, and then we can say that the Russians are about to answer the second defense belt. When talking about the eastern flank of the Russian Suma offensive operation, the village of Yunakivka is still a very powerful stronghold for the Russians. During the previous days, according to information we have, according to pro-Russian resources, the Russians entered the northern part of the settlement. Some sources, some pro-Russian sources, have already colored up to 50% of Yunakivka under complete Russian control, but we still haven't received anything that can confirm anything of that. Furthermore, according to information we have and according to pro-Ukrainian sources, they confirmed that indeed the Russians entered the village of Yunakivka, but every time the Russians were forced to fall back from the settlement. So as for the end of the 5th of June, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians still haven't managed to dig in deeper. So this is the situation in this area, but telling the truth, despite the situation on the eastern flank and in the central flank, we understand that the most important flank is the western flank, because if the Russians are able to take under complete control all villages, or at least the western flank of the second defense belt, we're talking about at least this territory that covers the villages of Kherson, Fedorivka, Mala Karchakovka, and Karchavka. This is going to be enough for the Russians to cut this area of the first defense belt from supplying support, and Ukrainians would be forced to fall back due to, of course, logistic issues. Anyway, despite the situation, the central and the eastern flank, we see that the Russians are going to open another direction. Currently, we see that the Russians are bombing and attacking this small, let's say, huge complex, probably forest, to the southeast of Yunakivka. We're talking about this territory. So most likely the Russians are going to move in this direction in the very near future, and they're going to do this probably during the upcoming days, just to test Ukrainian positions and to establish control over the settlement of Satki. I'm not sure that the Russians are going to move further in the direction of this huge forest, but at least this small forest can be taken by the Russians easily. So this is the first situation about the Russian offensive, but today we got lots of updates from the Ukrainian area of Ukraine offensive operation from the settlements of Tyotkina and Popovo-Lezachi. You know that when talking about this area, the situation is very complicated. You know that for the first time since the beginning of Ukraine offensive and for the first time since the beginning of the Russian offensive in the direction of the city of Sumy, several very reliable pro-Russian resources made their own statements regarding the situation on the ground around the village, and these sources are saying that they have strict connections with the units on the ground. So this is exactly what the Russians are saying. Tyotkina, so this is the title of the settlement. The situation is complicated. The Ukrainian armed forces are trying to cut off Russian fighters from by attacking north of the treatment plant. The Ukrainian armed forces also use drones to control the supply roads. So the supply here is partly the same as it was at the aggregate plant. That is, what can be dropped from the drones. The Ukrainian side is hitting the village with hammer-guided bombs, and a school and kindergarten have been destroyed. So in these pictures, where we can see how Ukrainians attack these constructions, these buildings with hammer bombs. So what the Russians are trying to tell us? The thing is that Ukrainians during the previous days, according to geolocations, according to the updates, Ukrainians from the 225th Assault Regiment most likely managed to break through the Russian defense belts to the northeast of the settlement of Tyotkina. And according to the Russian resources, the Ukrainians continue developing the situation on the ground. And according to Russians, the Ukrainians have established complete control over the only supply road that goes from the mainland in the direction of these two villages, Popovo-Lezachi and Tyotkina. So we are talking about this line. The Russians are saying that the situation is complicated, but I will translate to you to the normal language. The Russians are saying that the situation is critical. Basically, the Russians were caught in cauldron. So the Russians are fighting in this area without any supply and support. They are using just things, ammo, vehicles, arms, supply and support that they managed to bring to the territory of these two settlements before the beginning of Ukraine offensive, or before the Ukrainians managed to cut physically or to cut with drones the only supply line. The Russians are saying that maybe the Russians are were not caught in cauldron, but obviously this is the situation of the operational encirclement. But this is the main point, and this is exactly what the Russians are trying to achieve. Yes, the situation is complicated, and the Ukrainians are losing a lot of units while trying to attack Russian forces in this direction. Because once again, we were talking a lot about the situation. The Russian main forces are located just 30 kilometers to the east of this epicenter of Ukrainian offensive, just 30 kilometers to the east when talking about the territory of Ukraine. But obviously, the Russians have no problems to redeploy additional forces from the Suma offensive in the direction of the settlement of Tyotkina with the purpose to stabilize the situation, but for some reason the Russians are not doing this. The Russians prefer to continue offensive operation further in the direction of Suma, and the Russians show very good progress on the ground. So the situation is very complicated, and the Russians are fighting on the territory of Tyotkina, being completely encircled by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians suffer huge losses while trying to attack positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation with all their assault regiments, so we see very complicated. Anyway, sooner or later, we expect that the situation will be resolved, because today, for the first time, probably since the beginning of Ukraine offensive, the Russians began using heavy aviation. In this video, we can see how Russians were attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine with aviation bombs. So we haven't seen anything like this since the beginning of June and since the beginning of May, probably from this area. So the Russians most likely decided to stabilize the situation. The Russians are not going and are not not planning to fix this issue completely, because as for now the situation plays in Russian favor. They see that Ukrainians, for some reason, without any explanation, are sending thousands and thousands, maybe hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainians in the direction of the settlement, while the Russians still hold their positions. And at the same time, the Russians began bombing the situation around, with the purpose probably to give some operational pause for the Russians on the territory of the settlement, just to get a fresh probably batch of air or something like this. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but obviously the situation is very interesting and very complicated, both for the Ukrainians on the territory of Sumy and for the Russians on the territory of Tyotkina. Another important thing is that, if you remember, when the Russians just launched this offensive operation, we were talking a lot that the Russians most likely are going to attack in the direction of the city of Sumy, but most likely the Russians are not going to go through this huge forest. And we expected that sooner or later the Russians would be forced to open another direction, and most likely the Russians would attack the city of Sumy from the east. And today several pro-Russian resources adjusted their maps to the east of the city of Sumy. I'll remind you that several days or weeks ago, the Russians reported that they secured the village of Marina. This was confirmed by the Minister of Defense and by the Group of Forces North. And today, several reliable pro-Russian resources reported that another village was about to be taken by the Russians. So when talking about the end of the 5th of June of 2025, the Russians managed to establish complete control over something like this. And the Russians, as I understand, are going to continue moving further in the western direction, with the purpose to outflank the city of Sumy from the southeast and to attack the capital of the Sumy region from behind. So, telling the truth, it seems that the Russians indeed are planning to take under control the city of Sumy, and probably after this they are going to do even more. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kharkiv direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking the city of Kharkiv with drones. There were lots of explosions, and we have this video. Very interesting video, and in this video we can see how Russians with drones were bombing and attacking the constructions, buildings in the central part. Lots of explosions. All of those explosions were filmed and made. There was a video about this. At the same time, the Russians intensified their activities in the Volchansk direction. As for the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos from the settlement of Ovchansky Hutory. We have 4 geolocations where we can see how the Russians were hunting and destroying Ukraine FPV drone operators. You know that now it's like something like a golden rule: before any offensive, first you need to destroy the opponent's FPV drone operators, because without this you have no chances to continue offensive, because FPV drone operators can't do anything they like with your infantry. So that is why today we got lots of videos how the Russians were destroying Ukrainian FPV drone positions exactly in this part, which means that probably the Russians will try to advance, and maybe the Russians will try to cross the river of Volchansk. So you know that this is very interesting, because if the Russians are able to take under control these territories and to cross the river of Volcha, this can lead to unpredictable consequences, and the most important, this can be a very powerful media victory of the Russians, because now the Ukrainians think and they believe that the river of Volcha can protect them and can save them from an unexpected or fast-lighting Russian attack. And if Ukrainians lose their only barrier in, let's say, like the river of Volcha, this can lead to a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians. As for the opposite side of the northeastern part of Kharkiv, we're talking about the river of Oskol. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. Now let's talk about the southern Kupiansk direction, or the Lyman direction. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of icons, and we have already covered the situation in this area during the previous video. And the most important piece of news is that the Russians managed to encircle the village of Zelena Dolina. At least this information today was confirmed by different mappers. This information was confirmed first of all by neutral mappers, and then this information was confirmed by pro-Russian resources. So according to these updates, we see that the village of Zelena Dolina was completely encircled by the Russians, and most likely during these upcoming nights between the 5th and the 6th of June of 2025, the Ukrainians either would try to break through the encirclement with the purpose to evacuate and to escape this cauldron and to retreat towards more reliable positions around Shandrigolova, or the Ukrainians would try to counterattack the Russians in the area of these two pincers with the purpose to maintain a corridor for safer evacuation. Anyway, we know for sure that during the next 24 hours, very very heavy clashes we should expect exactly from this area. Furthermore, today we got this geolocation that was published by the 60th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russian infantry along tree lines, along these positions in these fields in the vicinity of Zelena Dolina. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map, we have colored this territory in Russian favor. So let's compare the map, and for example, this is the situation by the end of the 4th of June of 2025. The Russians, according to information we have, just started the encirclement of the settlement of Zelena Dolina, and today we got proofs. We got proofs that the Russians managed to move even further and basically to encircle Ukrainians, and we have geolocations that confirm Russian progress on the ground. So we see that now we got probably the answer to the most important question. And the question we got several days ago was where exactly the Russians would go further. We had several options. The Russians could continue offensive operation in the western directions toward the settlement of Lazovo with the purpose to cut the southern Kupiansk direction into several parts and then to handle with every single part separately. That was the first plan, the first option. The Russians could continue offensive operation in the direction of Barova, let's say in the northwestern direction, and the Russians could continue offensive operation in the southern direction, first to the village of Shandrigolova and then further in the southeastern direction through the city of Lyman. And now we understand that according to all these geolocations and all these adjustments that the Russians chose the third option to attack in the city direction of the city of Lyman. First, the Russians will finish with Zelena Dolina, then the Russians will finish with Kolodezi and Shandrigolova, and then the third battle of the city of Lyman begins. Now let's move further, let's talk about the Siversk direction. During the previous 24 hours we got lots of icons in this area, and it seems that the Russians got very interesting order. You know that according to information we have and according to numbers of updates we've received since the beginning of June of 2025, we believe that the Russians, the Russian military authorities in this direction got very simple order to clear the space between the city of Siversk and this village of Verkhnykamenskaya. So Russian FPV drone operators are over-concentrated in this area. Every single day we receive dozens of videos of geolocations exactly from this space, and the main purpose of the Russians is to secure every single square kilometer in this area before the beginning of a final offensive operation. As I understand, and according to all these geolocations, the Russians chose not to attack the city of Siversk using complicated routes of attack through the village of Grigorov, Kostirebryanka, with the purpose to outflank the city of Siversk to semi-encircle to maneuver. The Russians chose not an option to attack from the south, trying to shorten the distance to the main supply lines by attacking, let's say, from the settlement of Solidar in the northwestern direction. According to all these geolocations, we came to the conclusion that the Russians chose the shortest way from the settlement of Verkhnykamenskaya to the eastern flank, to the eastern part of the city of Siversk, because the distance between possible Russian position in the village of Verkhnykamenskaya and the city of Siversk itself is just like somewhere around 4 kilometers, which is nothing during another assault operation. So the Russians would first try this way, this approach, because if this, let's say, possible offensive succeed, then the Russians would increase the pressure with the purpose to dig in deeper on the eastern flank, on the eastern part of the city of Siversk, because this is going to be another huge media victory of the armed forces of the Russian Federation if they can control and establish a foothold on the territory of the city of Siversk, which is probably one of the biggest and strongest strongholds since the beginning of the special military operation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation around the settlement of Constantinivka. During the previous 24 hours, we got, as you can see, lots of icons and we have changes on the ground. First, let's talk about the Chasiv Yar, the city of Chasiv Yar. The Russians continue offensive, and today, according to information we have, the armed forces of the Russian Federation improved their positions from the city of Chasiv Yar in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Maiskaya. So the Russians took under control several trenches, several tree lines, and the Russians continue their offensive. Most likely they will try to cut this 0528 road with the purpose to probably ruin or to deal damage to Ukrainian logistic. Furthermore, according to information we have, currently the Russians are trying to attack the village of Bila Gora at least from two directions. First of all, the Russians during the previous 24 hours carried the probably biggest attack ever in this area using TOS flamethrower systems and using FABs and using just regular drones. As a result of attacks, several buildings were damaged and destroyed, warehouses probably were destroyed, and now the Russians are trying to push from the south, and according to information we have, the Russians crossed the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal to the northeast of the settlement, and now the Russians are trying to attack Bilogor also from the northeast. So we expect that during the next several days the Russians will take additional territories under complete control, and soon we are going to adjust this part of the Constantinivka direction in the Russian favor. Now let's move further. Let's talk about the city of Terezk. Today we got this geolocation that was published by the Ukrainians. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in between the city of Terezk and the settlement of Constantinivka. There are lots of geolocations, and for example this episode was geolocated. This is exactly the moment when Ukrainians attack Russians, exactly in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted these lakes in Russian favor. So we see that the Russians improved their positions, and now the battle for this complex network of fortifications has begun. If the Russians are able to take them under control, they will improve their positions obviously, and the most important from this area, the Russians would be able to establish fire control over the road 0522 that goes from the Kliban-Byksky pocket in the direction of Constantinivka. This can lead to a cauldron in the future, because the Russians are moving here. They have some plans. They are tasked to do this because the Russians continue offensive operation from the west of the settlement of Yablunovka, and today, probably the third or fourth day in a row, we got additional changes on the ground. You know that there are just several kilometers to the Kliban-Byksky water reservoir, so currently the distance is less than 7 kilometers, and once again, if somehow the Russians are able to establish complete control over the village of Yablunovka and Alexander Kalinova this way, and furthermore, if the Russians are able to improve their positions on this flank, then the Ukrainians in this pocket to the south of the reservoir itself would be caught in cauldron. We are talking about the settlements of Novospaska, Sherbinovka, Katerinovka, Kliban-Byk. This can lead to very, very bad situation and huge losses from the Ukrainian side in the future, of course. As for now, the Russians are still too far from this, operation. As for now, the Russians improve their positions, and we have geolocations that confirm this. In this video we can see how Russians were bombing the western part of Yablunovka, and in the second part of this video we can see Russian soldiers that were moving through the settlement in the eastern direction. So this episode, several episodes were geolocated, and now these are the changes on the ground. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions in the western part, and by the end of the 5th of June of 2025 the Russians established control over at least 5% of the settlement, and the Russians continue advancing. So this is the area, and this is exactly how the Russians are tasked, first of all, to improve their positions on the western flank along N32 road and to get as close as possible to the villages of Stepanovka, to take under control as many as possible strongholds in this area, and to begin the battle for the southwestern part of Constantinovka, because somewhere from this point the Russians will have all chances to continue offensive, not in the eastern or the southeastern direction, but in the northeastern direction towards the first buildings, first constructions of the Constantinovka agglomeration itself. When talking about N32 road, the Russians improved their positions, but probably the most important piece of news that, according to Russians, they managed to secure this pocket between Malinovka and Yelizavetovka. These territories were taken by the Russians during the previous 24 hours, and the Russians continued their offensive operation further in the northwestern direction. If the Russians, if this information is confirmed, then most likely the Russians will try to test Ukrainian defense in Nikolaevka, Novoekonomichna. If Russians answered Novoekonomichna, this could be also another huge media victory of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the South Donetsk direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours or 48 hours, the Russians launched another offensive operation, and as a result of several attacks, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the direction of the settlement of Alexeyevka from the northeast. Additional tree lines, fields, and fortifications in fields were taken by the Russians. The Russians managed to shorten the distance, so it's more probably main supply lines. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, today managed to answer the southern part of the settlement of Fedorivka. Several very reliable pro-Russian resources reported that currently the Russians control around 33% of the village and the Russians continue advancing. Several sources reported, also very reliable sources, that the Russians managed to shorten the distance to the village of Kamar to the minimal value. So according to all these updates, according to all these geolocations, according to the situation that the Russians established complete fire control over the main supply lines, we expect that the battle for these two villages would be finished in the very near future. The Russians will try to answer the settlement of Kamar from the east and the southeast, and the Russians will try to attack the village of Kamar through the village of Fedorivka also in the very near future. So it seems that this situation is already probably doomed, but let's wait and see what is going to be next. Very interesting is that during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of icons from the Zaporozhye direction, from the city of Orekhov and from the city of Gulyai-Polye. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians seems that carry out something like artillery preparation, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians began their offensive operation in this area and answered probably the village of Gulyai-Polye. We have lots of icons, we have lots of geolocations where the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions in the area of Gulyai-Polye and in the vicinity of Orekhov. And today we got the video when the Russians destroyed the bridge between the northern and the southern part of the settlement. Ukrainians have currently suffered huge problems with logistics, and the most important is that according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the south of the settlement of Orekhov and to the southwest of Novodanilivka. For example, in this video we can see how Russians were attacking edge positions of the armored forces of Ukraine with source flamethrower system. And as a result of this attack, several positions of the armored forces of Ukraine were basically destroyed. And later we got report that the Russians managed to improve their positions exactly in the area of Russian source flamethrower system strike, which means that the Russians began offensive, most likely with the purpose to get as close as possible and maybe to take under control some tree lines trenches between all these three villages with the purpose to cut this entire area to several parts. So anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next, but something big can come exactly from this area in the very near future. When talking about the Kherson direction, during the previous 24 hours, the most important updates are coming from the town hall of the city of Kherson. In this video that was published by the Russians, we can see how Russians attacked the town hall of the city of Kherson with FABs. The building was completely destroyed. We can see this building from several angles. This is the first angle and this is another angle of the same attack. The building was completely reduced to ruins, and we have photos that the entire construction was reduced to ruins as a result of this attack. So very powerful attack, and it was very surprising. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.